So, quick question for all of you. How many of you have taken a look at the Holocaust exhibit in our main hospital? Show of hands.
Cool.
Good. If you haven't, it is here until the 20th. I highly encourage you to do so. It's very informative. There are also, I believe, there are 5 different kiosks that are going to interact with the exhibit itself. If you have not attended any of the events that we've had associated with it, we do close out next Wednesday with Mary Barnett. They tell his family's story with their experience in the Holocaust.
Amazingly enough, that has a small tinge into our short story today.
Segue.
Yes. Absolutely. How are you guys? Weather's holding up. It's not bad at all. Annie's out there in the truck, but she's got a fur coat, so I'm not worried about her. I threatened to bring her in here and just turn her loose. You know? Yeah, those of you who don't know Annie, she's a Bernese Mountain Dog. She's about that big. She's a moose. Deb, Rachel,
Hey.
how are you?
Better for seeing you.
That's very nice of you to say. Yeah, no, not hardly. No, I have readers. Yeah, you can. More the merrier.
No, I can't stand you for my dinner.
I love Bernese.
Then I have to go through his service animal.
I didn't mention that, right? Didn't I mention she was a service
Okay.
animal? I guess.
That's why she's in the store below.
Yeah.
We got a seat for it right here.
She'd take it. There's a sofa available or a bed or anything. She makes herself at home. She's extraordinarily spoiled. I know. Sure, I'm game if you are.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out to the Billings Public Library. My name is Gavin Wilcher. I am the director of the Billings Public Library. It is a great honor to invite back Mr. Craig Johnson. He came to the Billings Public Library about 20 months ago, right? I got to tell this really quick story. Before that, this is my 6th year here. We hadn't had him. And I had asked, why don't we get Craig here? And everyone said, well, he just doesn't want to come to Billings. I wish I was a joke, but it's not. But since that time, paths crossed. This is his 4th time here in about 20 months. Yeah, absolutely fantastic, right? So I do want to do a little plug. Craig was down at the Miami Book Festival a couple weeks back. Take the time, go on C-SPAN, it's Book TV, watch that. He's with Brad Metzler and Scott Turow. And it's basically these 3 heavy hitters who are kind of playing off of each other. It's absolutely fantastic. So tonight, Craig has an original story that he's going to share with all of you. This is, I think, pretty awesome. This is his 2nd time with a Longmire Christmas. So we all know who he is. I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's hear this story. Okay, please join me in welcoming Craig Johnson.
How do rumors like that start? Craig doesn't like to come to Billings. All the time. Can't quite figure that one out like that, but yeah, once again, like that, here I am with another short story, like a bad penny to keep turning up. But yeah, the way this all, I should first say thank you, to the Billings Public Library for having me. My goodness, I used to have so much, respect for this institution like that now. And then, let's see, also this House of Books, the absolute, marvelous independent bookseller here in Billings, like that, which I feel very strongly about.
They're big supporters of the book, and it's just a fabulous bookstore. If you have not, been over there, you definitely need to go find it like that because it's absolutely a gorgeous, gorgeous bookstore. Like that. And then, of course, my wife, Judy, in the back corner over there, with the Longmire, with all of our stuff like that. And then a good buddy of mine, Michael Crutchley, drove over from Miles City. The youngest elected Texas sheriff, like that, of all time, like that, and he doesn't live in Texas anymore, which might have something to do with that. I don't know. Did you really get elected, or did you just like go in there and like put a hat on and they let you have a job? Anyway, like this is a joy for me. It's always fun, like it, because short stories. I guess I have to tell you, I give you the Reader's Digest version of how the short stories kind of got started, like that. And what happened was is that. We were sitting at the table there, at the breakfast table, like Judy and I, one morning, and I had one book out, The Cold Dish. It was the only book that I had out, and it's really hard, when you only have one book, you don't take up much real estate, in the bookstores. You have that one little turn, part of your book showing up like that, and so, we were trying to figure out if I was going to be able to make a living doing this or not, and she slid this copy of Cowboys and Indians magazine underneath my coffee mug and said, "You should do that." And only those of us who've been married long enough know how easily you can disregard the phrase "you should do that," And so I looked down like it, and there was a call for submissions to the, let's see if I can get this right, the Cowboys and Indians magazine, Tony Hillerman mystery short story contest. Literally, the name was longer than most of the short stories. Like that, for goodness sake. And so, anyway, I looked down, I saw this, and I looked at it, and I go, I don't write short stories. I'd never written a short story, so I just slid the magazine back to her, and then I went down to the barn, I'm down the barn, shoveling it out, and feeding the horses and everything. And those of you who've done that kind of work know how much free time you have in your mind when you're doing that kind of work. So I'm down there shoveling out the barn, and I thought, well, if I was to write a short story, what would I write it about? And so I remembered an instance that happened like that, and I thought, that would make a good short story. And so I came back up to the house, and I just quietly went up to the writing loft, and went up, and sat down and dashed out this 12-page short story. Finished it up, and I came down to lunch like I normally do, and cavalierly tossed my short story on the kitchen table there and said, "There's your short story." And that's when my loving and supportive wife read the short story and said, "Well, you're not going to win with that." You're right, it was my first attempt. You had some rough edges. As a matter of fact, that's all it was rough edges. And so, I thought, okay, all right, I got to work on this thing. And so I took it back up with me up in the loft there, and set it over to the side. I'd work on the books. And then every once in a while I'd have an idea about that short story, and I'd dig it back out, rewrite it, redo it, do something with it, and then put it away, and then I would, another month would go by, and I'd dig it back out again, and rewrite it again, put it away, another month would go by, I'd dig it back out, and then suddenly it dawned on me, I bet there's a deadline for this contest, And so, I went down and I dug into the magazine rack, and I'm digging in there, and I find the magazine, I pull it out, and it was that week. So it was really questionable as to whether or not I'd actually be able to get it in time. And so I thought, well, what the heck, I'll fire the thing off anyway. I didn't have much hope for it. Still didn't think it was all that good. And so I fired the thing off, and promptly forgot about it. And so maybe about a month or two later, I got a phone call. And it was Ann Hillerman, Tony Hillerman's daughter, who now writes too. And she called me up on the phone, she says, "Hey, Craig, is there any chance that you might be in Santa Fe in April?" And I was like, "No." She's like, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, no, that's 17 hours and 34 minutes. I know how far that is." And she's like, "Well, we'd really like you to come down, to Santa Fe in April." And I was like, "Yeah, no, I'm working. I'm usually by the end of April, I'm working on irrigation and all that. There's no way I can." And she said, "We'd really, really like you to come to Santa Fe in April." And I was like, "Is this about that short story that I wrote?" She goes, "We'd really, really like you to come." And I was like, "Okay." okay, all right. So I went and it won. I can't believe it or not. It must have been a weak year like that because it won. And the great thing about that was I got to go have dinner with Tony Hill. I got to sit there and have dinner with Tony for like about 4 hours. He was an old Oklahoma cowboy, and we sat there and we bullshitted, excuse me, the whole evening. Like I had a wonderful time. Like it was really great, and I learned more in that 4 hours about the business that I was getting into, like than I ever possibly could have from a master's degree or anything else. Like and so we finished up like that, and it came out in the magazine. It was really kind of wonderful. Like that, they had artwork for it and everything like that, and. I'm trying to remember, Michael, do you remember what was it, 05, 06? And I think it was like 06. I think it was like either 05 or 06, and it was the March issue. Look at, so you can actually find it. Look at if you want to dig it up, try and find it. Look at, but they, I had this short story. Look at, and there's nothing more useless to a writer than a singular short story that's already been published, because it's already out there. You can't sell it. There's nothing you can do with it. And so, and it's one, so it's not like you can publish it or put it out as an anthology, one, and so, I thought, well, God, what am I going to do with this thing anyway? And so I thought, oh, well, I shoved it back in the manila envelope and forgot about it. Well, then what came around was it got around to being December the next year, and I thought, at that point in time, I think I had about 4,000 people on my Post-it newsletter, which is the newsletter it's named after the Post-its that Ruby puts on Walt's door facing. And so, I had about 3,000 or 4,000 people on that, and I thought, what would be really cool is to send that out to everybody on Christmas morning to just surprise them with it. They'd wake up and they'd have this surprise Walt Longmire Christmas short story. And so I did it. I sent it out. This is back in the day, when we had to manually put the emails in and everything. It took hours to do it. And it was really kind of funny because the next morning, whenever we sent it out, people responded to it. And it was really kind of funny because I hadn't told Judy what I was doing. And so we got up the next morning and she turned on the email and it started going, and she immediately turns to me and goes, "What did you do?" Anyway, everybody really enjoyed it. It was really wonderful. Give something away to everybody for Christmas as a gift, And then I didn't realize how much trouble I was making for myself, because then December rolled around the next year. I started getting these emails saying, "When do we get the free Christmas story this year?" And I was like, crap, I haven't written one. And so I sat down real quick and wrote another one really fast. So I would have another one. And so I sent it out. Well, it became tradition is what it became. And so I would send one out every year. And it was fun because not every idea that you have is a 350, 400-page idea. Sometimes it's just a little snippet of an idea, just a little something. The one from last year, that was called Warms You Twice. You guys remember that one? And that's the one where the guy has his firewood is getting stolen. And so in revenge, what he does is he bores out the ends of the pieces of firewood and puts a little 1/8 of an inch stick of dynamite in there, and then the whole story, what happens is Lucian is there. He's the one the investigating officer, and Walt's just a poor deputy working for Lucian at that point in time. And he doesn't know what's going on, but as Lucian's sitting there talking to this guy in his house, he keeps picking up firewood that he carried in from outside and keeps throwing it in the fire and watching the guy. And then finally he reaches for the right one, and the guy's like, "Hold on." And he's like, "Do you have something you want to tell me?" And then the year before that, and that was actually from a true story from over in Campbell County in Wyoming, believe it or not. There was a guy that actually did that. And people ask me if I worry about running out of ideas, and I'm like, I live in Wyoming. I'm going to get them all written down, for God's sake. And then the year before that, that was I think it was musical chairs. I think it was was that what it was? And what happened was it's a domestic disturbance that Walt goes to, and what's happening is, of course, this woman has died. And so all of her children are fighting over everything in the house. And one thing they all want the rocking chairs that are on the front porch. And there's this big, huge argument going on about the rocking chairs. Were brought across the plains on a Conestoga wagon, and they're over 100 years old, and they belong to our grandfather and our grandmother, and we want those chairs. And Walt happens to walk up on the porch and lean one forward and sees the Cracker Barrel emblem on the back, and he's like, "Okay, I don't think so." But that was actually a true story too. That actually happened. So just about all of the stories have some spark of truth in them. And so what I've learned is to not push and try and write a short story. I just wait until I hear something, and then I'm like, okay, that's it. Like, and then I just dash it out pretty quick. And so I guess it was October, and I had not written a short story yet. And so I was thinking, get a little close, need to have a story here. And then November rolled around. I still didn't have a short story, and I was getting a little bit worried about it. So then, I think it was like towards the end of November, a guy wrote, an individual, like I don't know if it was a guy, a woman, or what, somebody wrote me an email. And they wrote me this email, and they said, hey, do you know this story? It's about Wyoming. And so whenever I hear a Wyoming story, I always send it to you. And so I look it up, and I see the story. Like, it's only about a paragraph long, like an instance. And so I look it up on the internet, and sure as anything, it did happen. It was real. And so I, immediately I was like, that's the story right there. And so I wrote the short story, got it all finished up like that, and then I thought, well, I should write that person back and thank them, for giving me that idea, like that, for goodness sake. I started going through the emails, wasn't there. That email was not there. I searched all the way through emails, all the way back to October. And I always like green flag all the ones that I'm supposed to respond to, and things like that. It wasn't there. So I don't know if it's like that I've lost my mind and I thought that email told me about that story, or, that it is that time of miracles, like that, and it was about time for me to need a miracle. Like that. So you can make the choice on your own here after you hear the story like that. So would you guys like to hear a short story? Yes. Okay, I've talked enough, like that, enough. So now I'll read here like that. And this one is, it's called The Perfect A. September 30th, 1972. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall in the windowless office at the end of the hallway that my boss, Sheriff Lucian Connolly, had assigned to me, thinking more and more that it might have been a converted broom closet. There was a year-old curled and yellowed VFW calendar circa 1971, but there were no pictures on the wall because I wasn't sure if I was going to stick with the job long enough to bother with it, and after the phone call I just had, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to stick with being married either. I'd just been on the job less than a week when Lucian had handed off the payroll expense receipts for the department when the phone had rung. I told Martha that I would be home for dinner, but it was looking more and more unlikely, and the conversation with my new wife had kind of deteriorated from there. The phone rang again, and I reached across the expanse of the battered surface of the surplus green metal desk and lifted the receiver with a great deal of relief. Listen, I'm sorry. Excuse me? I recognized the voice of Isaac Bloomfield, the chief and only resident over at Durant Memorial Hospital. I cleared my throat and tried again. Absaroka County Sheriff's Department, Walt Longmire speaking. There was a pause. Who? With a week on the job, I was getting used to that response. Walt Longmire, the new deputy, Dr. Bloomfield. We met 3 days ago in the emergency room. I nestled the receiver in the crook of my neck. How can I help you, Doc? Is Lucian there? I sighed, also getting used to that response. No, I'm afraid he's not, but can I help you? There's a situation. The concentration camp survivor went on. Salvatore Ibarra was in town at the grocery store earlier today, and one of the cashiers mentioned to me that he'd had a spell while trying to carry his groceries out to the truck. One of the shepherds for Extapare. Interestingly enough, I've run into him twice this week. I scribbled down the name on the notepad, I'm not sure why, and then grumbled to myself, what is he, about 100 years old? There was the briefest of pauses. He's the same age as me. I cleared my throat, thinking of the tattooed numbers I'd seen on the inside of Isaac's wrist when I'd shaken hands with him the first time over at the hospital. Right. They helped him back to the truck, but they called and said that he was complaining of dizziness, chest pain, and discomfort in one of his arms. Where is he now? I would assume back in his sheep camp up on the mountain. Do you think he got back up there before the ice storm settled in? I don't know. It was very late in the afternoon when he was at the IGA. So you want me to go look for him? I hate to ask, but I'm deeply concerned that he might have driven off the road to be lying on the ground somewhere up there near his sheep wagon. I'll go take a look. One more thing? Yep. If you don't mind, I'd like to go with you. I thought about how much assistance the centenarian would be, but kept my mouth shut, one of the lessons that I'd learned in the Corps, 1 week in law enforcement, and a month or two of marriage. Oh, I'll be by to pick you up in a minute. Standing, I eased out of my tiny office and tromped down the steps past the photos of all the previous sheriffs of Absaroka County, thinking about the phone call with my wife and wondering if they had faced the same problems as their newly minted deputy. Probably. Things just hadn't gone well between us, and it seemed as though everything we said or did led to some sort of an argument. We had a baby on the way, money was tight, and neither of us was sure that I'd made the right choice in taking the job or coming back to Wyoming. Pushing the front door open and turning to lock it, I started down the steps and was immediately confronted with a world encased in ice. It was one of those invidious storms that we'd all dreaded, a raw day just as September had ended, and then a rain that had turned into a wind and a glaze of ice when the sun had abandoned us. Cranking my hat down and making my way towards the tiny Bronco half cab I'd been assigned, I slid on the veneer of the parking lot like Sonia Henney. Grabbing a hold of the side of the bed to save my life, I carefully groped my way around the tiny truck, locking the hubs on the front differentials and then opening the door to climb in. I fastened my seat belt, sighed, and then started the small V8, shifting the little truck into four-wheel drive, figuring I could use every advantage I had in going in the direction that I pointed the thing. I nodded to myself, thinking about the man in question, Salvatore Ibarra. The man had devoted his life to such a solitary pursuit. No wife, no children, practically nothing in the middle of nowhere. I slowly drove the short distance, thinking of the 2 times that I'd seen the Basco over the last week. A minor intersection fender bender, which when I'd arrived, he'd admitted to not having any insurance, but had nervously pulled out a wad of $100 bills the size of a Campbell's soup can from his pants pocket, and peeling off the bills until the man that he'd run into was satisfied. When he'd seen me staring at the cash, he'd explained that he didn't trust banks. The only other time was 2 nights ago when Salvatore had been put out after the bars had closed and decided to serenade the Main Street with the Philip II aria of Don Carlo. I'd gotten out of my vehicle there on Main Street and stood listening as he hung onto a lamppost, the power of his bass voice vibrating the storefront windows. At the end, I'd applauded and he'd bowed just before sliding down the post and then passing out on the sidewalk. I'd loaded him into the bed of the truck like cargo and driven him up to the office, where I'd carried him in and placed him on a bench in the entryway under a blanket, just so he'd know that he hadn't been arrested. In the morning, the old Basco was mortified and offered to pay for any damages, but I'd waved him off and told him that his performance was actually pretty good, and I wasn't sure why anyone would have complained. He'd mumbled something about some people not preferring Verde and had gone on apologizing again before going out the door, and that had been 48 hours ago. Fortunately, there was no one else in the road to run into in the 3 blocks to the hospital, where Isaac stood under the portico of the emergency entrance, the picture of ridiculousness. Wrapped in a long raincoat, a hunter's cap with flaps up, galoshes, and holding an umbrella. He walked out from the relative refuge of the covered area, opened my door, and climbed in, settling himself in the passenger seat. "Thank you for doing this, Deputy Longmire." Pulling up, I drove away and could still feel the tires slipping on the glassy surface of the road as we headed west, gaining altitude. Any idea where his grazing lease is? Hunter Trailhead, towards French Creek. That's pretty exact. Did you speak with him recently? No, but I've known him for quite some time. Turning the first corner of the switchbacks going up the mountain, we felt the glissade as the utility vehicle, ignoring the direction I'd turned the wheel, continued sliding to the other side towards the guardrail and the 1,000-foot drop-off. Gently pumping the brakes, we slid to a stop, and I spun the wheel further and started off again. You mind if I ask you how the chief resident of the hospital comes to be chummy with a Basque sheep herder? We both play the violin. I glanced at him. Excuse me. There was a recitation at the high school some years ago, and we sat next to each other and discovered we both played. His eyes stared through the thick glasses and through the windshield into the night. He plays very well. Better than me, actually. He smiled to himself. His occupation allows for a great deal more practice time than mine. The smile faded. I received lessons as a child, but then gave it up. The war? He turned to glance at me. I don't mean to pry, but I saw the tattoo on your wrist. He nodded, folding his hands in his lap. Surprisingly, hold on. Surprisingly, that's when I returned to it. His eyes went back to the windshield. I was in a work camp, a slave camp, really, where we assembled the components for V-2 rockets. Our camp commander took pride in having an ensemble, and when they discovered that I could play, I was forced to join. Sorry, Doc, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. No. It may have been the music that saved me. Placing a hand on the dash to brace himself, he turned. Do you play any instruments? I used to play piano, but not for some time now. He smiled. The war? I guess so. Smiling back at him, I took the cutoff towards Paradise Guest Ranch and was relieved to get off the pavement where there was a little more traction. I'd been careful to watch the roadsides, making sure Ibarra hadn't slid his aged international into the borrow ditch, but I hadn't seen anything in the frozen slush that might have indicated that he had. Are you all right, Deputy? You can call me Walt. He nodded. I don't mean to pry, but you seem kind of preoccupied. Oh, just some trouble with the wife. Ah. Ever married, Doc? No, I never seemed to have time. We rode along in silence, bouncing over the ruts until Isaac's expression softened as he gazed at the dim light of the gauges recessed in the dash. Ibarra actually had quite the correspondence with another famous musician. Who was that? Toscanini. I cut a glance at Bloomfield. The conductor? The conductor? He nodded. Indeed, the maestro himself. Arturo Toscanini? As in music director of La Scala in Milan, as in the Metropolitan Opera, as in the director of the New York Philharmonic, that Arturo Toscanini? Why, Walt, I think you've been hiding your light under a bush. He nodded, searching the sides of the road for any sign of the shepherd in his truck, finally breaking the silence of the question, did you know how he got his start? I took the turn at North Creek and glanced at the ice-encased lodgepole pines and laughed. Toscanini? No, a little before my time, Doc. He was working with an orchestra of an opera company touring in South America, and they had hired a local conductor who turned out to be inept. The show was only hours away, and in desperation, the company suggested the assistant chorus master. Without any conducting experience, he was convinced to take up the baton and led a 2.5-hour performance of Aida, entirely from memory. From what I understand, his performance was astounding. The doc glanced at me again. He was 19 years old. Following the gravel road, I weaved between the great boulders and the rock outcroppings as we drove upward. Wasn't he beaten up by a bunch of Mussolini's thugs? He was, at the Teatro Comunale in Bologna. He refused to play the fascist anthem and was attacked by the black shirts. It was shortly thereafter that he left Europe and came to the United States for good. Kind of like you? Somewhat. He smiled. The maestro was always very open about his opposition to Nazi persecution of the Jews all the way back to 1933, when he wrote Siegfried Wagner that he would not be conducting in Germany because the request had been made by an upstart politician, one Adolf Hitler. Making the ridge, I turned and followed Hunter Mesa Road. Did they ever meet? Toscanini and Hitler? No, Ibarra and Toscanini. He adjusted his glasses and the smile curled onto his face. Once, but I'm sure only one of them would have remembered it. It was 1950, and the maestro was touring with his orchestra, and they happened to alight in Sun Valley, Idaho. Ibarra traveled all the way there and waited at the train station for 4 hours just to get a glimpse of the man. Did they get a chance to talk? No. Salvatore said that he was far too embarrassed to speak to him and simply waited as he waved at the crowd and then climbed into a motor car and was swept away. He did say that when he waved back, Toscanini actually made eye contact with him. He said it was one of the most thrilling moments of his life. Pulling to a stop where the road had ended in a cattle guard, I could see the boxy outline of an International, shining with a thick coat of ice, where the door hung open and the headlight and running lights were on, but growing dim. Isn't that Ibarra's truck? Isaac peered through the darkness. Yes. I switched off the ignition, disconnecting my seatbelt, and cracked open the door, the ice covered in the sheet metal splitting and falling to the ground as I climbed out. Walking towards the truck, I reached in and turned off the ignition switch and the lights, and then glanced at the bags on the floorboards. I looked over the hood at the doc who had followed me. The groceries are still in here. We both moved forward towards the front, finding the barbed wire fence that had been stretched over the cattle guard, still hooked at the bottom. Stepping over, I pulled out my flashlight and then stuck a hand out to help Doc across the ice-covered pipes as we moved towards the darkness of the lonely escarpment in the God-forsaken spot. Nestled in the tree line, I could see the dim light of a window of a sheep wagon and the smell of fire, probably from the stove inside. Picking our way, we encountered a large number of sheep that parted in front of us, only to recluster themselves as we passed. Once at the wagon, I placed a boot on the steps and then rapped on the door with my glove-covered knuckles. "Mr. Ibarra?" There was no answer from inside, except for the tinny sound of a transistor radio softly buzzing with static. "Salvatore?" With a final look at Isaac, I reached up and pressed the latch, allowing the door to slip open, revealing the soft golden glow of a few candles and the tiny stove and the fire that we'd smelled. At first I thought the wagon was empty, but now I could see the aged shepherd lying in his bed, motionless, a motionlessness that I had grown to know on the battlefield. Stepping up, I trailed a hand back and pulled Isaac into the wagon, where we both stood for a moment looking at the man. Quietly, the doc stepped forward and retrieved the violin from Ibarra's one hand and then the bow from the other, and then, ignoring the sheet music lying on the man's chest. Sitting on the edge of the bunk, he placed a few fingers at the Basco's throat. Still holding the violin and bow, he tucked Salvatore's arms under the blanket and then pulled it over the man's peaceful but grizzled face. I took on my hat and reached down, turning off the small transistor radio at the bedside, silencing the static. I glanced at the walls, but could see only a patch of paper that had been encased in a cheap discount frame. Reaching down, Isaac lifted the sheet music and studied it. "What is it?" "Barber's Adagio for Strings." It was one of Toscanini's first premieres and Salvatore's favorite. I thought it odd that Bloomfield continued to mention the conductor, and then watched as he turned the music towards him and did what seemed perfectly natural at that moment, and tucked the butt of the violin under his chin, positioning the fingers and carefully sliding the bow across the strings. The sound was one of desperate longing, a sadness so pure with a pathos that hung in the air with an enormity of soul and voice. I'd never heard Ibarra play, but if he was better than Isaac, then I doubt I could have withstood it. The tears slipped from the doc's face as he played with lengthened, loving strokes, the composition of passing that caused my breath to cut short. Overcome, I reached out and steadied myself with a hand against the inside of the wagon wall, accidentally knocking a loose piece of paper that had been tucked in the gilt frame. It fluttered like a leaf, finally settling at the dead man's blanketed feet. Reaching down, I picked it up and read the scribbled words on the brown paper, crumpled with age. "Mr. Conductor, I have only two possessions, a radio and an old violin. The batteries in my radio are getting low and will soon die. My violin is so out of tune I can't use it. Please help me. Next Sunday, when you begin your concert, sound a loud A so I can tune my A string. Then I can tune the others. When my radio batteries are dead, I'll still have my violin. Salvatore Ibarra." As Isaac continued to play, unable to help myself, I reached over and pulled the frame from the wall to discover a neatly typed response with a spiraling signature and the letterhead of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra in Carnegie Hall, dated June 3rd, 1935. "For a dear friend and listener back in the mountains of Wyoming, the orchestra will sound a perfect A at the beginning of our next radio performance. Arturo Toscanini." Isaac continued to play as the deeply buried emotions were dislodged and carried away by music, and by the time he finished, I rubbed a thumb and forefinger across my eyes. Overcome, I stepped to the door to find 100 or so sheep now gathered around the doorway of the wagon, their heads uplifted in expectation as if the music had provided something beyond bereavement. As Isaac finished, I watched as he guided the glasses from his face, looking like an aged Caesar. Pulling a handkerchief from his pocket, he dabbed at his eyes and then looked up at me with just a hint of that same sad smile. He rose, took the frame, slipped the paper back on the edge of the glass and then rehung it on the wall and stood there gazing at it, even going so far as to pat the tarnished frame. That's sometimes the way of things, Walt. Left to our own devices, we forget ourselves and fall out of tune, hopefully fearless enough to reach out to a higher power for that one note that will bring us back to an agreement with ourselves. I watched as he wrapped the music around the bow and then tucked it and the violin under his coat, slipping past me and stepping down and out into the night without another word. He slowly walked towards my truck as the sheep made way like wet wool waves, bleeding, and then silently circling back and following him like a wake in a current. Glancing around in the lonely confines of the tiny wagon, I thought of Salvatore Ibarra, the man who didn't trust banks and who had serenaded me while hanging onto a lamppost, a man who had spent so much of his life in a self-imposed isolation, but had found a concordance in those years ago through the kindness of a temperamental and exacting conductor and a Sunday afternoon radio program from a city far, far away. I also like to think that it gave him a comfort and a harmony in the last moments of his life, because that's simply the way of perfect notes, a resonance that never fails. It's a true story. I checked it all out, and I looked it up, and the guy that said well, it may have been a woman, who knows, or it may have been an angel, who knows. Somebody sent me that passage was a brief a paragraph about Toscanini's radio program, and how he began one of his programs by saying, "We will now play a perfect A for a shepherd back in Wyoming whose violin has gone out or two." Wow, that's just perfect. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Anybody have any questions? Anything you'd like to ask or anything like that? Anybody? You're quiet tonight. Yes.
If I could do it without crying. So I taught another man's moccasins in my mystery class this semester, and one of my students is here too. And Walt's in the bar, the Boy Howdy Boku Good Times Bar.
Yes.
And, I can't even remember the name of the base. Playing piano.
Tensanut,
I say again.
Tensanut Air Force Base,
Okay.
Yeah.
Not that I'll remember.
where the Marine investigator Walt Longmire is about as welcome as excrement in a pool.
One of your best, not that they're not all the best. And he's playing by ear, and he's playing all different kinds of music. So I was wondering, did he get that from you?
No, I know how to play the radio. That's all I know. And we actually, my wife completely redid a piano, an old Henry piano. Is that, did you just buy that, or was it from your family, or where'd that piano come from anyway?
It was a family, I don't think
It was a family one, and she refinished the whole thing. So we have this beautiful piano up there in my writing loft that I studiously ignore. But our granddaughter actually plays and so we always get a recitation every Christmas whenever she shows up. So I'm looking forward to that. So, anybody else? Guys are.
Is that story gonna be out around Christmas?
It will be, yeah. If you're on my newsletter list, you'll get it in your inbox on Christmas morning. We made a mistake, and we sent out the thing that had all of the events all listed, and we sent it out, and a lot of people got confused and thought that the short story should have been attached. And so once again, the email started going, what did you do? And so once again, I had to write another email out to everybody and say, it'll be on, it's Christmas morning. We don't cheat at our house. You have to wait till Christmas morning. Anybody else? Anything else? Yes.
Is there a new Longmire TV season out? Is there going to be?
No, not right now. Not right now. I think I talked about this when I was here for the book before. But yeah, it was funny because when we were doing Longmire days, we just announced we gave away, I think it was close to, I can't remember how much it is. Yeah, to a bunch of different groups. We gave a lot away. Once again, gave a lot of money away for charity, which is what the whole idea, the whole thing is for. But I was talking to Robert about it, and that was in August, and he was like, "Well, I heard that they're going to drop us, in November." And I was like, yeah. And he was like, "What? You don't believe that?" And I was like, "Robert, I've heard that for 6 years. That Netflix is going to drop us." I said, "You know what? Every week we're in one of the top 10 to 20 shows on Netflix. And so, no, they're not going to drop us. As long as that's up there and it's getting those kind of ratings, they're going to hold on to it for as long as they can." And so I got a sneaking suspicion that since Netflix was not able to come to terms with Warner Brothers, we're going to have to wait until Netflix drops the show before Warner Brothers will consider thinking about making more episodes. But I know all the actors are fired up and ready to So we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, there are these wonderful books. Over there. Lovely present. They mail wonderfully. They don't take any batteries.
Mine does. I don't read it, but George Goodell still read your
Oh
books?
yeah, yeah, oh
That guy,
yeah.
I love that.
No, I'll never trade George in
No,
like that.
no,
That
no.
And you know who I got him from was Tony Hillerman. It was Tony Hillerman. Like when I had that dinner with Tony, I was doing the negotiation for the audiobooks, and he said, "Who's going to read your books?" I was like, I don't know. Like, one book author. Who knows who's going to read my books? I'm like, I got a say in it. And he said, "See if you can get George Goodell,
Yeah.
because he does all of mine, and he's wonderful. Like, so see if you can get a hold of him." And so the next day, I was talking to audiobooks, like, and they said, "Well, we got a couple of different readers we're looking at. One of them is George Goodell." And I said, "Him." They said, "You don't want to hear the others?" And I was like, "No, if he's good enough for Tony Hillerman, he's good enough for me." Like, and so that's how I got George. Like, and so I think I've told this story before, but I want to leave you guys with a laugh. Like, and so anyway, what happened was that I actually happened to be in New York
At one point in time when George was doing one of the recordings. And so I went in the studio, like, we had a really wonderful conversation and everything. He's a great guy. And we finished up, like, and so I looked at him and I said, "He's got one of the most amazing voices I've ever heard in my entire life. I mean, my gosh, you must, the width and the breadth, of your abilities with your voice. You must be an incredible singer." And he goes, "Oh, no, I'm not." He says, "You don't ever want to hear me sing. You never want to hear me sing. My family don't ever give away a weakness." And so the next book was actually Dark Horse, and that's the one where Walt's out on the Powder River in the cheap motel, and the guys next door are playing the AM radio really loud, and it's Eddie Arnold's cattle call, like, George called me on the phone. "You son of a bitch." "George, how are you?" Walt sing for $5. I said, "Let me tell you, I don't sing." And suddenly you have Walt singing in the next book. Suddenly you have Walt singing, you have him yodeling. Really? I'm not sure that he's completely forgiven me for that. Guys, thank you so much for being here tonight. I've got my $10 bill, and I'm happy to sign for you guys. Yes, sir.
Have you ever been invited on CBS Morning News?
Nope, never have.
Because they do a lot of book artists and stuff like this.
You should write him and tell him.
You
Call him and tell him. Throw him out.
Because I think you really need to.
Oh, thank you. You should talk to my wife. She thinks I talk enough. Anyway, thank you guys so much. Oh, pretty great. Yeah, and last year we were able to give $30,000 to the Missing Indigenous Women's Resources too, which was really, really wonderful. Like this. But yeah, it's been kind of nice because it's kind of raised, because I've been working on that, for like about 5 years now. Like, and so it's a joy to see it get more traction. Within like
Summer of that Longmire days.
You bet. No. Here, let me.